Good evening, everybody. We've got lots of you joining us now, so we'll get things underway. Thank you for being with us on this very warm Tuesday evening here in the UK. Before we do get going, I'm just going to go through some housekeeping. So first of all, it's always nice to know who we've got in the room, so please introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from. It's always nice to see our international audience and diverse professions with us. For those of you that want them, we'll be issuing certificates of attendance to all of those joining you, all of you joining us live this evening. Angie's presentation is going to be around 30 to 40 minutes. We'll follow that up with a Q&A. For your questions, if you could pop them in the Q&A box, have a look what's already been posted. You can upvote them just so that we don't duplicate any questions. What we'll do is we'll take them in popularity order. So if you can post them live as we go through and the questions are fresh in your head, that'll give people time to upvote them as well. We'll also make a recording of the presentation available, so you can all access that afterwards, and you'll get a link on email. So please be patient with us. It will come out to you. Just a little bit about BASRAT before I pass over to Andrew. We're the Professional Association and Regulator for Sport Rehabilitators in the UK. Since March 2020 and lockdown kicking in, we've been hosting these regular CPD webinars, many of them in partnership with Steriplast, just to bring you kind of education and useful CPD and kind of business advice. We've covered all sorts. If you do want to support our work, you can do that by becoming an associate member. The benefits are there, and anyone who's interested can pop me an email afterwards. I'll pass over to Andrew. We'll do a quick intro for Steriplast and then welcome our guest speaker this evening, Andy Jackson. Andrew.
Thanks, Ollie. Evening, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time out, and thanks, Angie, for your time. We've really appreciated the expertise from all of the guest speakers that we've had over the last year or so, and the events have continued to go from strength to strength. So yeah, thanks to Ollie and everyone at BASRAT for helping with that, but also to all of the guest speakers who've helped to make the events so informative and interesting. Obviously, thanks to everyone for getting involved and for all the good questions and things that get posted up. So quick introduction to Steriplast. We're a medical company based in Manchester, so it's really all of the consumables, first aid items, tapes, everything that you need from a first aid and medical perspective, really. And we're really pleased to be working in partnership with a range of sports teams, from grassroots to professional level, some national governing bodies, and of course with those that are working in sports rehabilitation as well. If you could just move it on, please, Ollie. So the Injury Rehab Network, we started as a local network where we're based in Manchester in 2019, and the kind of principle behind it was to bring together those that are involved in working in sports injuries and sports medicine, and to provide a forum for people to network and collaborate. So the events we're hoping to get back in person at some point when it's safe and we're able to do that, because we know that the networking also adds a lot of value for people that are able to get along. So for this year, we've had a really good series of monthly events, and we've still got lots of events to come. So as you can see there, Steve Miller is coming up next on the 1st of July, and Steve will be talking about calf injury rehab. We've got Barry Monk in August talking about skin cancer and the role that those that are working in sports therapy can play in sort of identifying and being aware of the signs to look out for. And then Ian Horsley and Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed in the autumn. Ollie and I are due to be having a discussion soon about some ideas that we've got for other guest speakers. But if you do have any other suggestions, or if yourself would be interested in speaking on a topic, please do get in contact and let us know. So I'll let Angie introduce herself, but really just to say thanks very much for your time. I'm confident that this is going to be another brilliant presentation. Angela's a very experienced physiotherapist with a lot of expertise in working with younger athletes. So I'm sure it'll be of interest, and everybody will learn a lot from Angela's presentation. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed for introducing me there. Let me just get my slide deck up. Okay. So hopefully you can see that. Ollie, can we have thumbs up?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Yeah. All righty. Brilliant. Okay, let me just move that. So thank you very much for giving up your evening. We had a chat before about whether the Euros football was going to have a competition tonight with our talk, and we think we've squeezed it in. So hopefully we can bring some value over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes. So what I want to really think about tonight is the difference between these two pictures pretty much sums up the whole talk, whereby you've got one who's got full of beans running like a Duracell bunny, and the other who's flat out exhausted along with his little doggy. So just having some fun there on moving the slides along. Ollie, is there anything you can do?
What you might want to do, just try stopping your share and resharing them. This has happened before.
Okay.
Should be an easy fix.
Let's just come out. Okay, let's try again. Okay, how are we looking this time?
They're not up. Have you shared them through Zoom?
Yep. Okay. Try again.
There we go.
How's that?
Perfect. There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. My name's Angie Jackson. I've been a physiotherapist for far, far too many years, and I'm on an absolute mission at the moment. Every week in clinic, I make too many children cry, and that's not a great accolade. And the reason behind that is I tend to tell poor little kids that they can't go on tour. They've got to have 6 or 8 weeks out of sport. And sometimes with some of the lumbar stress fractures that we end up diagnosing, we can end up telling kids that they're going to miss the whole season. So invariably on a week by week basis, I see too many little children and I break their hearts. So I want your help to basically see if we can educate the athlete, educate the parents, educate everybody to see if we can reduce the number of injuries. I was that young injured athlete. I probably did too much too soon, and I didn't know all the rules. So I spent the last probably 30, 35 years trying to work with young athletes to understand why some athletes get injured, yet others don't. My 2 poor kids were my guinea pigs. I'm safe to say that somewhere along the line, we got the recipe right, and they're both now international athletes. But they were very tolerant of all the mistakes I made and trying to find that ultimate recipe. And for both of them, that recipe is very, very different. And that's what I want to come through tonight, really, is there is no one single recipe. So we do need to make sure that we understand each and every one of our athletes. I've been the volunteer consultant physio to the Cheshire Cricket Board, hence why I do a lot of these lumbar stress fractures. And more recently, I've sold my clinic and I'm now absolutely passionate about getting this message out. So what do we need to do to build a successful athlete? We need to get the balance between all of these different dimensions. And we obviously can't cover all of them in a 30-minute presentation, but we're going to touch on each of them and work out not necessarily what happens when we get it all right, but what happens when they become overloaded or we get it wrong. So we really, really need to start asking questions. If we don't know why a specific injury occurred, how do we know what questions to ask the athlete? And my little girl here was the sort of the type of person that I want each and every one of you therapists to be. I want you to be that why kid that says, why, mummy, why, all the time. Become a toddler and establish the why in the subjective. My first question invariably is always, what's changed? We want to know what has been different in their world, be it load, be it footwear. There's so many different things. But I always pretty much say, so tell me what's different. What's been going on in your world that you think may have caused some of the problems you've come to me today with? And most importantly, we need to know the demands on the athlete. If we don't know what this kid does, each and every day of their life, each and every hour, then how on earth do we rehabilitate them in order to make sure that they're actually robust enough for the life that they lead? And we need to understand the demands of their sport. And basically, you can't be good at everything. So if, say, for example, this little girl's grown up to be a professional windsurfer, and so most of you won't have even known what that involves. But if you ask her for a video of what she does, then she'll easily have one on her phone. Every little kid can definitely give you a video of either their hero or them playing sport and showing you what it is they did and probably what they were doing when they got injured. So get to know the demands of the sport, work with your coaches, and then understand their injury history. Has this kid been like rumbling on with lots and lots of growing pains? Lots of these apophyseal type severs or Osgood Schlatters. And more importantly, have they had a previous stress fracture? So what sort of demands do we see? Well, inevitably, there's the physical stress of sport. But these kids are generally, and when I'm talking about kids, I'm really talking about up to their mid-20s, where perhaps they're just finishing university and juggling a zillion things. So what we're aware of is just how time poor they are. Most of the time, they're juggling academia, they're juggling the sport they play, and usually several sports into the boot. And so things like sleep become second down the line, and they don't always get good sleep quality. They don't even necessarily get sleep quantity. So we want to start looking at all of these different aspects and how it might impact the athlete that's in front of us. So LEA stands for low energy availability, what they fuel themselves with. We need to think about what their attitude to recovery is, how much academic pressure they put on themselves. So if you've got an athlete who's maybe really, really trying to be the best they can be in sport, well, are they also trying to be the best they can be on the stage, in music, in their academic life? And certainly some of them are perfectionists. They've got a real fear of failure. And this is where some of the psychological aspects come in that massively overlap with their injury risks. We need to understand what kind of pressures they're under to try and fit in at school. And equally, are they under any financial pressure? I've got lots of young athletes who had to juggle a job just to be able to afford to play the sport and pay the coaching bills. So what do we actually know about this athlete before we even start? And I cover a lot of this in a like pre-participation, pre-assessment questionnaire. I try and get as much of it as I can. Are they in the middle of a growth spurt? How much have they grown? What do they weigh now? What's their height now? And also, what's mum and dad's height? What sort of, height might we get? And what centile were they born on? Start to really get to know where they're at. So it's all about establishing the why. So we need to know the risk factors for any of the injuries that we are, these kids are presenting with. So we need to split them into those that are intrinsic, so a decreased capacity in the athlete, and those that are extrinsic and more relative to their environmental or the load that they place upon themselves. And these are just a few of them. And what I want you to do is start to think about the ones you know about and the ones you don't, and the ones I don't know about, because I want to have a bit of fun at the end on a social media thing, whereby we look to say, let's all build the biggest list we can of all the risk factors we can think of, so that with education, I'll write you a blog on each of them, and we can all learn around the different things that we all think might impact our athletes, because you may have expertise in areas I don't. So we'll talk about training errors, and we'll talk about recovery. We'll mention sleep, and we'll think about fuel. Tonight, we're not going to look at strength or fitness in any great detail, nor are we going to look at the elements of psychological stress and growth spurts. But we want to split these into load and the capacity or the current capacity of the athlete. So previously, I always used to think about performance was just equal to fitness minus fatigue. That's the old sort of recipe. But I'm going to put some questions around whether we can literally stick with just that as our analogy at the moment. So I'm sure lots of you have seen different little images like this. This is my take on it. So if you imagine that each of these blue units are units of you going to the gym, you going for a run, or any of the athletes that we work with. And the red line is going to be relative to the recovery that we take in between each of these units of activity. So what you can see in the top one is that the blue units are nicely spaced out. There's a recovery that goes above the horizontal, so it's above the baseline. So we know that they're getting adequate recovery. They've got something in the tank ready to go again. And if that's the situation, that tiny little blue dotted line that I hope you can see is going on an upward trend. And that symbolizes that they're likely to be getting fitter. And maybe that will also be representative of an increase in performance as well. But what happens if we start to sandwich those blocks together? What happens if that red line never makes it back to baseline? So we're not getting adequate recovery and we're doing too much too soon for the body. Well, what we see is that yellow line starts to be a slippery slope. And what we'll all be aware of is that at that point, what do you think the coach says? What do you think the parent says? And the athlete's there going, look, I can't even reach the personal best, the PB that I had in swimming or athletics last year. So I've been better than this 12 months ago. So what do we think the temptation is? Well, the temptation is to train more and train harder. And all that does is mean that the recovery slope is even lower and we start to slide towards a situation of illness or injury. So the research backs that injuries and illness occur not with too much training, because otherwise, how would people be endurance athletes? How would they do these 100-mile runs? So we know it can't just be around too much, but it's when we're not fit enough, or we do too much too soon, with too little recovery, too little or the wrong type of fuel, when we're going through an adolescent growth spurt, or potentially with really poor technique. So there are some instances where technique is relevant, but I'd say look at the ones above it first. So if you look at this graph, which I've adapted from some of the research done by Tim Gabbett, what you'll see is that there's two green lines. If you're below the bottom green line, well, in essence, you're just doing too little and you're not going to be fit enough for whatever it is you're ready to do. And what you look at the top line is you're actually not robust enough to go above that at the moment. That's our current capacity. So what we want is at the start of a season, we take things easy. We gradually do a bit more and a bit more. And maybe during the season, we're staying just below that threshold, above which we may well get pain and injury and fatigue. But then along comes a really wet week. And the following week, we've got to cram a whole load of fixtures into our schedule. So we go above the line and we do too much too soon. That's our training error, that spike. And then suddenly, because we then feel really, really sore or really, really exhausted, we're now doing so little that we're below the threshold. So we get into this sort of boom and bust culture where we're literally either aching or we're resting. So we need to get that to flatten out and really understand what the athlete's doing and teach them some of the rules about the too much too soon. Identify what might be causing their spikes. Do they understand that? And can they sort of start to plan ahead a bit so that they're not so amplified? So we've got to start getting our athletes into the balance between load and capacity. On the load side, we're not only thinking about physical, but mental. And we need to balance that off with the teaching them about stress management, nutrition, and good sleep and recovery. And it really is like treading on a tightrope with some of these athletes. If you want to perform at the best of your ability, you're always going to be pushing the boundaries. If you're pushing the boundaries, it's a fine line between being injured and performing at your best. So we know that they're going to always be taking some gambles, and it is a bit like a tug of war. So we as therapists need to start to think about, well, how do we understand what they're capable of? How do we understand the training responses? And this in itself is probably an entire lecture. But what we can do is plan, assess, reflect on what went right and what didn't go well, and then start to take control of the situation and plan again. So we need to plan for peak performance. When does this athlete need to be at their best? There's very few sports where you need to be good every week for 52 weeks of the year. And in fact, all-round activity in the same activity all year has been linked to a much higher risk of injury. So when is it that their national championships are? When do they need to be at their best? Because we want to get them to build towards that, not be peaking way too early. And once they start to get buy into what we're teaching them, how did they respond to training? So maybe I'm going to show you a couple of really neat tricks that you could use to monitor their training load. So what should we be asking our athletes? So just sort of stop and pause for a second. And I want you to think about in the last subjective that you did with an athlete. So that might be a kid who's a non-elite athlete. They might be a really elite athlete, irrespective of the age, because you might not work with the adolescent population. So just think about which of these questions did you ask them before you created their treatment plan? Did you ask them about how much? Did you ask them about how often? Well, I reckon pretty much everybody in the audience will have done that. We may fall short if we ask them about intensity. So how hard did they work in each of those sessions? How much fuel did they use for each of those sessions? How tired were they afterwards? And what's their stress levels like? So how many of you ask for an activity diary? How many of you get the athlete before you start working with them to fill in, right, what do you do on a Monday? What do you do on a Tuesday? And so that we actually know about volume. How many of you use some kind of scale to understand about intensity? And how many of you ask every athlete about their dietary needs? So think about all the athletes that you're working with at the moment. How many of them are vegans? How many of them have got an allergy to some kind of food, such as celiac? How many of them have an eating disorder? Or maybe are just disordered. Maybe it's things like they weigh food, they're calorie counting. So what do we know about their dietary intake? How many of them have you asked about the amount of sleep that they get and what their attitude to recovery is? And how many of them have you spoken to about how well they're coping? So unless we're prepared to really get to know our athletes, I would question how effective you are in rehabilitating them. So one of the modes that we could use for looking just at volume has been the acute to chronic workload ratio. And don't worry if those words aren't familiar to you. What we basically mean is, what have you done for the last 4 weeks that's prepared you for what you're going to do this week? So it's a sort of ratio between the past month and what you're currently doing this week. And Tim Gabbett called this the injury prevention vaccine. So what you're looking at is, if we think of this as maybe you guys are runners. So let's think of these as miles that you run each week. So within the table, we've got week 1, 6 miles, then 2 is 4 miles, 5 miles, 5 miles. Now, I'm no mathematician. So effectively what we're looking at there is the cumulative total now is 20 miles. We'll divide it by the number of weeks, which is 4, and we get ourselves to an average of 5. Now, most of the research says that you can get away with somewhere around a ratio of 1 to 1, 1.2, 1.3, but above that, we might start to see more injuries. So in essence, around a 10% increase of 5.5 would be a safe load to do. And then you can knock off week 1 and take it into a rolling average. But what any of you who follow things like ACWR and monitoring our external workload will have read is that this has come in for a bit of Twitter slander, shall we call it, because coupling the averages, so basically linking them all together and giving the last 28 equal weighting, is perhaps not wise. So then Williams came up with the exponential weighting, where you had moving averages, which maybe takes account of the fact that fitness isn't relevant 4 weeks ago as it is what you like this week, but fatigue is more relevant in the last few days than it was 4 weeks ago. So that was perhaps moving forwards, but it's quite a complicated calculation. And why 4 weeks? Why 4 to 1? Should it be 3 to 21? Should it be all sorts of different ones that have been suggested? The critical bit about all of this is it probably doesn't matter how you monitor it as long as you monitor something and you get the athletes used to avoiding spikes in activity. But what they've got to work out with you is it's individual. If you had a 0.8 of a ratio, or maybe like 8% maybe for one athlete, is going to be more than enough to create an injury or illness, whereas another one may tolerate much greater spikes in activity around the 15%. So we do need to know our athlete. So what's been suggested is that we use something called the session of rate of perceived exertion. And we'll go into that in the next slide. But fundamentally, it's looking at what we call internal load, which measures how the athlete has responded to whatever volume they've done. So I use this scale, which is a sort of a kiddie-like adaptation. And what I've done is put some emojis in there. And if you look at a scale of 1 to 10, so 1 is I'm still half asleep. 4 is I'm sweating a bit, but I can still chat as I talk with my mates as I run around the hockey field. By 7, I'm sweating buckets and I'm beginning to pant and conversation's not so easy. And by 10, I'm going to throw up and my legs are like jelly. So we need to introduce athletes to the concepts that not all sessions are equal. So if I said to a kid, right, you've done 60 minutes hockey at school today, give me a score. Well, it's 2 ways of looking at this. They may say to you, like it was dead easy. It was a 4 out of 10. It's only a school session. And then I might say, well, what was your county session like tonight? That was an 8. That was really, really hard. So you can suddenly see 60 minutes times 8 or 60 minutes times 4. The load is not the same. But there's other ways of looking at this, because don't assume that all school sessions are going to be light and easy. Because if you spoke to a kid who's maybe an England player and he's playing for his school side, well, all the pressure is on. Because when he plays for England, there's 11 players on that pitch who can share the load. When he plays at school, there might only be him. And he's still just as competitive and there's more pressure on him to perform. So we need to get kids into using a diary, and we need to get them into thinking about intensity. Because there's another way we can look at this. Because kids can't just rock up at school and club and go, you know what, sir, I can't play today because I'm all out of minutes for this week. My ACWR is basically telling me that I'm done. I can't do any more. Well, that can't happen. So the only way that you can get a kid to actually downgrade that session and bring the load back is to teach them about RPE. And what you can say to them is that whilst you can't control whether you do the PE session or you don't, what you can control is the intensity. You don't have to work at 100% at all sessions. And most kids, if you say to them, like basically try your best, well, what message are you giving them? Are you telling them that they've got to work out of 10 out of 10 all the time? Are you saying to them, the coaches, you can hear it all the time, go hard or go home? We don't want that. We want kids to take ownership of saying, no, actually, I need this to be a lighter session. And we really, really need to educate them about sleep. What's known now is that in normal bone, you've got this ongoing sort of remodeling process between bone formation and bone resorption. And within the bone, we have what we call bone markers. And this particular one, bone formation marker, i.e. it makes bone, is called P1NP. And if the sleep is restricted, there's less of it, or we go to bed at erratic bedtimes, then that reduces the amount of P1NP. And this creates a potential window of bone loss. And that is a perfect recipe in an adolescent who's growing like a weed, whose bone density is already a little bit less due to the fact that their bones are stretching, for a stress fracture. And if we couple that with the fact that with energy expenditure, if it's greater than energy intake, we get something called low energy availability. I mentioned it earlier as being abbreviated to LEA. And this to me is now the biggest explosion in why we get injuries. And it's so important that we really understand the athlete in front of you. And there's 2 ways of getting low energy availability. One is unintentional. These are the ones I want you to really watch for. Because how on earth does an athlete know whether they need 2,000 calories or 3,000 calories? And what if mum is on a low calorie diet because She basically wants to eat really healthily because she's trying to lose weight, but that's the food that she puts in front of little Johnny. But little Johnny's got 4 hours of high intensity sport today, and he needs a whole lot more calories because he's growing and he's doing way more intense sport than perhaps his mum, his dad, or his little sister. So we need to really understand how much these kids are eating, the types of foods they're eating, whether they've got any dietary needs, or whether in fact, as a more serious consequence, they're intentionally trying to lose weight, either to fit into weight categories like rowing and boxing and the martial arts, or are they trying to lose weight because they want to be skinny beans for either a social reason, or perhaps it's the aesthetically pleasing sports traditionally like gymnastics and dance. And we need to be so aware of what their attitude is to food. You've really got to get to the bottom of this. Look for those like slight glances between mum and child. Mum will be like going, "Ooh, I've been worried about this, but I daren't say anything." Because in athletes at the last Olympics, some of the figures around disordered eating, which just means things like calorie counting or weighing food, slightly cutting out certain food groups, could be as high. Some of the evidence says 20%, but some of the other research has been as high as 70%. And there's been a huge amount in the press recently by Jessica Ennis, by Colin Jackson, by Freddie Flintoff, who are all basically saying the prevalence of this sport is so high, and how much they regretted the kinds of pressures that were applied to them and how wrong it was and how it inhibited their performance. So how do we tell if the balance is right? We need to start tracking with the experts on pain. So if they had a history of niggly injuries, stress fractures, what's been going on? But do we always pay attention to fatigue? Are you looking at this athlete and looking at their big baggy eyes? They're yawning while they're there. And at the moment, what I'll say to you is the last 12 months has meant that this is less evident. These kids have grown more because they weren't doing as much sport. They're not as fatigued as having done a whole season of sport. But we need to be watching and asking around sleep quantity and quality. And we need to track their wellness. Ask them, have you had any repeated sore throats? Are you getting lots of viruses? More critically, have you started your periods and then they've stopped? Or did your periods never start? And we'll talk about that in more detail. And we need to speak about growth spurts, because also we need to know if they're not growing and they're underperforming because actually they're not getting enough fuel to actually support growth. If they're on an international program, they're probably tracking their resting heart rate. So we can actually ask them about that and get them to monitor it, because it is a real insight into whether things are starting to go wrong. And then look at stress levels. And if they're with their parents and you ask them whether they're moody or they're irritable, watch the interrelationship between mum and child, because all of this will cumulatively create a loss of performance. So this is what I use. There's tons of wellness questionnaires out there, but just get your athletes into thinking about these 4 metrics: fatigue, sleep, soreness, stress. Ask them to mark them every day before they do sport or when they get up, out of 5. And my suggestion would be is that 5 out of 5 is a really good score. 1 is a pretty dire score. And I haven't yet had the opportunity to have a big enough cohort. So if any of you are into research and you want a project, here it is. I want to know what kind of scores we should be looking at to say don't train, and what kind of scores we can say to them, lower down that intensity and train light, and when it's okay to train. Because this, I think, is going to turn out to be athlete dependent and dependent on the day, depending on what of all the other stresses are there. But maybe this is something that we can really teach our athletes to monitor. Because if it all goes wrong, then we're going to end up with different syndromes and conditions. And this particular one, underperformance syndrome, or let's call it overtraining syndrome or under recovery syndrome, because they've all been utilized around the same set of symptoms. And what it is a prolonged and unexplained decrease in sports performance, critically greater than 10%. And that's usually as reported either by a drop in PB or a drop in performance as related by their coach. But what I think is most interesting is the recent research is coming out that this could be with metabolic, endocrine, biochemical changes related to long-term shortage of energy and a mechanism of repair. So how closely is that correlated to the next syndrome we're going to look at? And particularly in the EROS studies, which if you really look at the research, you might query it, but I think it's opening up lots of great conversations, whereby underperformance or overtraining syndrome, the standalone factor in this study, the independent factor, was insufficient protein and low calorie intake, much more so than the traditional metrics we used to think of as training load and recovery. So it starts to look like we really need to know whether our athletes are getting sufficient protein in order to do the rehabilitation programs that we're doing, in order to do the sport that they're currently performing in. And in addition to that, sleep and social factors were heavily linked to this particular drop in performance. So what I want to query is, how does that differ then to relative energy deficiency in sports, known as RED-S or REDS? Because again, it's a condition of low energy availability affecting male and female athletes of all levels and ages, which may or may not include multi-system involvement, where there's impaired growth, development, impact on wellness and well-being, which will culminate in that reduction in performance. So it all seems to come back to low energy availability as a driver for all of these things that we just talked about. So what I want you to just look at is two of these different ones. One over here is the reduced muscle strength. So you need to be aware that if they've got reduced muscle strength, how on earth are we going to do really good ACL protocols, return to sport protocols? So we have to be asking these difficult questions. And you'll see that there's two that are highlighted in red, because traditionally they were known as the female athlete triad. And because we recognize that many of these symptoms were also prevalent with the exception of loss of periods in boys, then RED-S became a replacement or a different sort of take on the female athlete triad. And this started out with a reduction in energy availability, leading to spectrums of menstrual dysfunction and loss of bone mineral density. So how does that link to us? Well, if you've got low fuel intake, the body starts going, crikey, if there's no more food coming, I'm going to start shutting down some of the non-essential systems. And one of those will be immunity, and one of those will be reproduction. So in boys, they'll start to lose motivational drive. It's possible that if they've started having morning erections, they may start to lose those as well. And in girls, we're starting to see either erratic periods that stop, or alternatively periods that never start. And when these sorts of hormonal changes happen, the calcium starts to leak out of the bones, and it starts to go to help out in the essential systems. And so bone density becomes reduced, and we start to see some of these stress fractures. And for me, the one that I want to control more than any other is lumbar stress fractures. So if you're seeing any child with low back pain for more than 1 to 2 weeks, we should be assuming that they've got a stress fracture until proven otherwise. Over half the athletes in studies are basically having stress fractures when they're scanned. So what we need to look at is, if you've got low back pain and you've talked to them about recovery and low fuel intake, that balance of probability goes up. So we can start to use periods as a barometer for hormone health. If they've not started their periods between the ages of 15 and 16, their risk factor for stress fractures goes up, particularly if they're a lightweight athlete, or they've got any known low bone mineral density, or they've had a previous stress fracture. But how many times do we ask, well, when did your period start? Have they ever started and then stopped? And do you get less than 9 in a calendar year? Because all of these are real barometers of hormone health. Now, I don't want you to diagnose every kid that's absolutely exhausted, who's not performing well, who's got low energy availability with any of these, from Red S to female athlete triad to underperformance syndrome, until they've seen a medic. Because what you need to be aware of is that certain endocrine disorders, gynae, anemia, vitamin D deficiency, and many of the viral type infectious things can also mimic many of these symptoms. In the Euro 21s, we've obviously seen this poor athlete collapse on the pitch this week with a cardiac event. And it's not yet known, I don't think, what his actual trigger was. Now, you can rest assured this guy will have been screened, and Cardiac Risk in the Young do an amazing, amazing job of screening athletes. But it's not foolproof, because what we've shown you tonight is it depends on the day. What was his fuel like? What was his hydration like? Did he have any viral overload? Had he been overtraining? We need to know all of the factors, because it's a whole complex set of symptoms that's going to determine the athlete's injury or illness factors. So we go back to being a toddler. We need to be really comfortable with asking the uncomfortable questions. Don't be afraid. This is going to help you become a really great therapist, not just a good one. It's going to inform our decision making. It will ensure successful outcomes. It's going to prevent injury after injury. And we're going to make sure that we look after the long-term health of our athletes and help them be the best that they can be. So my whole remit now is, yes, I'm still clinical, but it's all about education. I'm trying to put together as many sort of educational resources as I can on my website. We've got one for the athlete that basically now will help you to be able to signpost athletes to the recipe for success. And that will enable them to learn in different modules over around 12 weeks, depending on how many modules they do at a time, all about nutrition, all about how to monitor load, recovery, and many of the different stress elements and how to balance a workload. There's courses for athletes on how to develop athletes. And in addition to that, my absolute passion of low back pain in athletes, we're developing one for the parent, and we're really, really looking at the cricketing world, because they are seeing so many stress fractures. So to sum up, the recipe for success is to avoid spikes in workload, try and keep these athletes to less than 10% increases week on week, and get them to understand what works for them. We need to plan for our recovery. Make sure that they don't do no more than 2 back-to-back days of high intensity activity, no more than 4 times in every 7-day rolling period. They need to plan for recovery, make sure they're getting good sleep, good energy. We know that fitter, stronger athletes get fewer injuries, and we need to adapt that load during growth and teach them to manage their stress. So I want you to really think about why some athletes become injured or ill, yet others don't. What have you learned tonight? Try and look for my social media on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Angie J Physio. And what I want you to do is see if you can help me. Start tagging me in posts. If you want to have a free draw for the Developing Athlete course, then like the post, follow me, and then tag 2 friends that you think would be interested in the content. But most importantly, let's make this about educating each other. So please, please join me on my mission. We can do this together if we educate the athletes, the parents, the whole coaching team, and importantly, us practitioners.
Brilliant stuff. Angie, can you leave that slide up for me?
Yes, of course.
One of the big questions that we always get from loads of people in the chat is, how can they contact you and send over questions?
No worries.
And I'll help to share that on social media as well, so that we get lots of feedback coming in and lots of suggestions. And we'll keep sharing and circulating that to keep the discussion going. The Q&A is absolutely on fire. We've got loads of questions and lots of interest in them. So we'll dive straight in. I don't want to waste any time. Anthony is first up. Great question. What techniques, education, or tools do you use to help educate athletes about their own stress management?
So I don't know if any of you were on my therapy live talk on Friday morning, but basically the one that I like for all athletes, and actually all my old ducks, if I'm honest as well, is one by Blaise Dubois. And it's his stress modification tool. If you go Google Blaise Dubois, Dubois, and he's got the running clinic in Canada. He does some fantastic resources, and go to there to his load modification or stress modification tool, and you can download it. And Blaise has basically given us permission to laminate this, to share it with athletes. It's a phenomenal tool to really show them how spikes in workload initially might make them they might have to take things steadily. Spikes in workload initially will be a problem, but as they get more tolerant, better adapted, their bones get stronger, their muscles get stronger, then what used to make them cause pain no longer is even enough to keep them strong. It's a phenomenal message.
Great stuff. Paul Geisler, thanks for joining us, Paul, from the US. Hope you're well. Have you developed, found, or used any simple digital tracking to track student intensity, energy levels, sleep, etc. on a regular basis? So an app, or I know loads of kids with smartwatches, etc. now.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So my daughter Sarah did that for her sports science degree at Bath, and there's a lot of the research around tracking workload has come out of Bath University. And so Sarah's got a really good spreadsheet that she's devised that works for her. And she's been really, really good about tracking that on an Excel spreadsheet. There's all sorts of people. I think Adam Virgil's got one. There are some apps, but I've never found a free one. The higher up the chain they go, the more they get access to good apps. And the biggest problem is at the grassroots level, where we're all seeing these high volume numbers of kids in trouble, then there isn't really a good resource. So maybe if somebody's really techie, we could make one together. I think if Sarah had a little bit more time, then that would be her ideal, like, next stage, really. So we need one is the answer. And yes, it needs to look at calorie intake. It needs to look at sleep. And it needs to look at tracking load and planning, really. But no, I'd love to find one.
And the difficulty as well, if you were trying to track objectively, is also having something that they can wear that will monitor them during activity. So you're talking about a much higher level of tech than just an app on a phone or whatever else.
You are indeed. And the problem we've got is that, again, part of her dissertation was the comparison between wrist-worn gadgets and the polar heart rate monitors. So few athletes. My other son did it on elite hockey, and he tracked it. And basically, we know that the data is amazing if you've got a GPS and a heart rate monitor on. But in the general population, what I tend to use is something like the recovery one, and getting them to do a diary. And if they basically do volume RPE to create a session RPE and just get them into that, and then they basically look at their pain levels, their stress levels, and their fatigue levels on a day-by-day basis, it's enough. These guys are time poor, so don't make it complicated.
Yeah. Amelia, another ton of votes for this question. So with youth athletes specifically, there's more than just the athlete involved in the rehab process. So parents, multiple coaches, different sports. How do you approach these factors, not only with the athlete, but with their parents, coaches, and so on, so that they understand and buy into the process?
Was she actually listening when I said to a kid, I guess probably the best way to do it is that children buy into the message. They know that they've got something wrong with them. Let's go a lumbar stress fracture. If I say to a kid, look, I really, really need you to have 6 weeks out. We're going to work on your strength. We're going to make you better than you've ever been before. But you're going to have to buy into the way in which I can get you better. And we're on a journey. And then there's this pause. And this parent said the other day, so is it all right if he plays in his Worcestershire trial the other day? And I went, I'm not sure you were really listening then. The kid's got to have 6 weeks out to prevent a much, much more serious injury that's going to take him out for 6 months. And there's like, but. So I back it up with a handout. They're both available on my website. There's the lumbar stress fracture handout, and there is also an athlete development one. So that goes out to every athlete. In your subjective, you could do a form that you could send out to each and every athlete before you see them. So they're already buying into this whole package. But yeah, we do have problems. But I think when you start to sort of talk about these are either avulsion injuries, if we catch them early, then maybe it's only a few weeks out as opposed to 6 months. If it's a lumbar stress fracture, it's the same. So if we get these athletes early, we're talking about a few weeks out, some change in the rules, and they buy into it. So this is where my mission is I go around clubs, I go around schools and talk to athlete groups, coaching groups. And this is where I need everybody's help, because we've got to get these resources out there.
Do you have much discussion with the coaches in that process? Will you send the resources to them?
Yeah, the buy-in is amazing. The problem you've got at the grassroots, so if I work with, let's say, a national governing body, or I'm working with an elite football club, some of the work that I get asked to do, then there's no issues whatsoever in terms of getting all of this data sorted and getting the kids in the right place. But I'm not really that sort of, I think the bigger sort of mission is around the young local cricket club, the young local football club. And so these are usually dads that are supervising the kids because their little Johnny or their little Sarah plays. And so what we've got to be massively aware of is they are feeling really, really insecure. And if we just point out to them that they're blissfully unaware of some of the things that might go wrong. So if each of you could get into your local clubs, and as I say, we've got packages they can be directed to if it's not your sort of bag. But we've basically got coach education packages, athlete, and these are what we want you to get these messages out into the community, because I think most of it is just lack of education. I don't think it's, in many instances, a lack of desire to comply. There are instances of that, and most of it's based on not intentional. I don't think so.
So, coaches, I found on the whole are massively concerned for the welfare of their young athletes. It's just making sure that they've got the right information to relay, isn't it?
And up-to-date information as well. You work on the principle that I have an online kids course, which I looked at it and went, oh my God, I absolutely need to re-update this. And so if we struggle to keep up with the data and we struggle to keep up with the research, how on earth is a coach supposed to do that? So I believe a lot of our job has got to be in helping them make more informed decisions.
Yeah. I'm going to break my own rule, because there's a question that is really, really important. And we've touched on low energy availability. It's around that. And then if we've got time, I'll get to the other two really popular ones. What's your advice for managing an athlete with intentional low energy availability issues?
So I'm in the middle of a big child protection issue. So I guess I'm probably well positioned to talk about this. During lockdown, we had 6 intentional relative energy deficiency athletes. I'm going to shock you in that one of them is only 12. And she lost 18 kilograms in 12 weeks, and it was intentional. And she was doing 4 sets of online classes per day. And it was off the back of her mum told her she was never going to be a athlete with the shape that she had. She was a perfectly normal little 12-year-old that was pubescent and perhaps carrying a little bit of weight, but hardly any at all. And so we have a full-blown eating disorder. And so one of my colleagues, Lucy Gilbanks, who's a real specialist in this, and she did her degree, master's at Oxford on the topic. And I work with these athletes to try and explore their beliefs, but it's beyond our remit. So we've brought in this instance, we had to notify the school and the GP because there was a safeguarding issue. Yeah. And then in addition to that, we work closely with people that can really, really make a difference. There's some great nutritionists around with this as a special interest. Nikki Key and the BASM website is good for it. Yeah. So I can put some posts with Lucy if you follow Lucy as well. But basically, we can put some posts out there in the next few days, just helping to signpost you to the places to go. But you need to align yourself with a nutritionist because this is getting pandemic-y. I'm seeing this. The more you ask the questions, the more you realize it's there. If you don't ask the questions, you won't have a Scooby-Doo as to how big a deal this is. Yeah. And on a local level, for people that already aren't linked in with a nutritionist, is GP typically your go-to? you have to go to the GP because it's a pretty much an obligation.
Yeah.
And you also need to explore. So I obviously needed to check, why is this kid's period stopped? Why is she losing so much weight? So obviously we could be looking at some hideous diagnoses.
Yeah.
So you need your GP on board, but the GP just didn't get it. And then she went to, all of them end up with a clinical nutritionist that's a pediatric anorexia specialist, and they don't understand because they tell them to go and eat high calorie food like McDonald's. And these are athletes and they want to eat well. So you've got to basically look for a team around you with good nutritionists, good psych support, because these kids have really got some pretty horrendous beliefs and their parents are usually worse.
Thank you. Important topic. I wanted to cover that, even though I broke my own rule. So Jean-Pierre, how do you handle the difference between the parents' understanding of intensity of training and recovery and the players' understanding of training and recovery? Kids think they're always working really hard and parents don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because we use, I don't know around the world what the rulings are, but I tend to ask all my parents to accompany their children realistically up to at least 18, because all I say to them is, there's so much information I want to tell your child. And basically, if you take in 30% and your kid takes in 30%, well, you've got more chance of both doing it. So my approach is that every parent will be in every session, so that when we're imparting information, that we're really stressing the idea that the kid mustn't work. I can't remember, I get a little bit lost in my talks, but the analogy I use, which works really well, so humor me if I've already said it, is that if you're working at 100% all the time, it's tantamount to working in first gear in your car. It burns fuel and it basically wrecks your engine. So we need kids to understand that they shouldn't be working at 100%, and that as parents, we don't want your kid to do that because they will burn out.
Yeah, fabulous. I'm gonna make sure we finish on time. There are lots of questions remaining, so I would normally put my closing slides up, but I'm conscious that people will want to get in touch with you and send those questions. So, guys, send them over to Angie on social media or email if you're not on there. I'm sorry that we've not been able to get to them all, but that is always the case with these events. They're really popular. We always get tons of questions. In terms of following on from this event, you will get linked to a short feedback survey at the end. We'd really, really appreciate it if you can just take a couple of minutes to fill that out for us. Give us your feedback on tonight's session, and also give us your feedback and suggestions for future events that we're going to run for the Injury Rehab Network. So topics, speakers, if you want to speak yourself. I believe he's still in with us. So we do some work as well with the World Federation of Athletic Training and Therapy. There's a plug for you, Glenn. And I'll be arranging some webinars with the World Federation as well. So if you don't see us running one of your suggestions, we might be doing it over there. So please get those in for us. Like we mentioned earlier, we will be sending out certificates, the contact details, links to resources, and a link to the recording for this evening. Please bear with us. I will get it out to everybody tomorrow. Andrew, do you want to come back in? Any closing remarks for us?
Just as always, thank you very much, Angie. Thanks, Ollie, and thanks everyone for all your contributions. It's nice to see that people are listening to Angie earlier on, and lots of why questions at the end there. So really good. Angie, if you don't mind, I've got one quick question which you probably get asked all the time. What are your thoughts on the balance of kids sort of doing multiple sports or activities versus specialising in one, and when and how should they do that?
Did you see my original presentation? So the last slide, but I was mindful I was going to run massively over, was basically exactly that. So some Danish, I can send you the slide, but basically Jan Lemur has done a really good infographic on it. But the long and the short of it is, the later you specialize, the more likely you are to succeed to the very elite level. So more gold medals were won at an elite level when they didn't specialize till 15, 16. I believe you need to play 3 sports until you're into your growth spurt, basically, and then start to turn it down. So you need a balance. If you could, I know Ollie's little one's little, so we want gymnastics, Ollie, please. Lots of monkey bars swinging from the playground. And then that gives them a great platform. Dance is another good one. They need to have that whole cross section of different sporting skills, and then they can start to specialize. But all I can say is emphasize that there's no rush. Every kid that I will work with will start to look at when the average age of an England team is, and we'll start to make a plan. And usually they go, oh my God, that's more years than I've even been alive. And then at which point the parent goes, okay, chill.
Yeah, no, I think that's always been my own sort of personal perception on it. My kids are 10 and 8, and they do kind of everything. And I think my view at the age they're at now is that they just need to learn to enjoy sport. And if they're having fun and socializing with their friends, then like you say, they'll learn different skills and through doing all those different activities.
I went to a really, really good talk probably 5 or 6 years ago now by a guy called Dean Crilliars. He works with Cirque du Soleil and talking about physical literacy, and multiple sports definitely feeds into that, you know, developing different movement patterns, strength in different movements, different areas, and developing a range of skills as well. So, you know, not just being a strength athlete, but also being a well-rounded, you know, power athlete, endurance athlete, etc., all rolled into one.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with that.
Brill. I don't know if you've seen the chat, Angie, but there's tons and tons of thank you messages in there. The feedback looks brilliant. And
Thank you.
as I said, if people take the time to do the survey, we'd really, really appreciate that. When I bring us to an end, it kicks us out really abruptly. So I apologise. I will say bye, and then we'll all disappear. And that will be the end. So thanks very much again, Angie, for giving us your time this evening and sharing your knowledge with us. It's been really useful.
No, absolute pleasure.
And we'll certainly help you on your mission.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Evening, everybody. Enjoy the Euros, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much, Angie.
My pleasure. Take care.